Well, thank you very much, Dirk. You've given us not only more optimism, but you've complemented, I think, very nicely Dani's great overall overview of industry and services and their trends with a more kind of granular approach, where you kind of integrate more specific sectors in a more diversified economy, and not so much either or, but how you integrate services with industry and services with agriculture, which may help perhaps identify niches of where opportunities for African countries or low-income countries to go in. And also I think where there is quite a bit of convergence with what Dani was talking about is the importance of selective policies, complementing non-selective policies in the pragmatic exercise of things like using perhaps some tax incentives, or using well-run national development banks, or special export zones to promote specific sectors that would have higher productivity growth and the political economic challenges. And now our final speaker, last but certainly not least, Nick. I've just looked at his CV. He not only has a vast experience of working and writing on many developing countries, as well as being senior economic advisor at DFID, but very surprisingly for development economist, but because he's a mathematician, holds a patent in risk management of derivatives, which I personally find very impressive. It means that he actually understands derivatives, which I think most bankers don't. So I look forward very much to your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. I've got two slides, which are there we go. Discussant response. Fantastic. I'm here in lieu of DFID's chief economist, who was sitting just over there, who snuck in late. There he is. But he had a very good excuse for not being here, going to see the cabinet secretary. So he sends his apologies for not actually being here, but I'm sure you can catch up with him afterwards. But I have to say that my boss, Stefan, tends to like to delegate growth stuff to me anyway. So I'm not entirely surprised that he said, go and talk on this thing, would you, with Dani Rodrik. Well, I have to say that Stephanie and Dirk have put me in a rather difficult position, because I'm here to be disagreeable and to try and find fault with what Dani has said. However, as Stefan knows, I've spent many years largely spouting Rodrikian ideas in DFID and pushing them. So I've had to really strain to find objections. But I think I found one or two, and so I'd be very interested in hearing Dani's response. It's upsetting hearing Dani be pessimistic about the power of economics to transform the lives of billions of people. It's rather like your local priest losing his faith. And so I feel it's incumbent on us as the development community to attempt to reintroduce faith to the poor lost pastor, and give him a couple of lifelines where he might resurrect the power of economics to transform the lives of many, many people. So, we all live, or many of us live, in some of the sort of ideological framework that Dani has provided us over the last sort of decades. And now we kind of barely notice that we speak in this language. But a lot of them were, if not sourced by Dani, he certainly sort of promoted them. Growth diagnostics is a really big one now, which is very common, but it wasn't common in, was it 87 when you first wrote the paper? 2005. Sorry, 2000. Decades out of sync. 2005. So just the attitude of wanting to find the next constraint, the importance of private sector investment in growth, the idea that there could be equilibrium constraints, that political economy and factors could conspire together to form a balance in an economy, a dysfunctional economy where some people are benefiting. These ideas were new. His focus on convergence, that this is what counts in the long term. As a development profession, we're drawn towards absolutes, aren't we? We want dollar-a-day poverty. We want to look at GDP per capita. But in the long term, it's going to be the relative position of developing countries relative to the OECD. That's what's really going to count. My grandchildren and your grandchildren won't be worried about $1.25 a day, but they will be very worried if African incomes are still 6% of OECD incomes, as they are at the moment. He also pioneered this idea of the growth frictions of weak institutions, that even though your labour cost might be incredibly low, the bad institutions, the ecosystem that surrounds businesses in developing countries are so appalling and the costs are so high that it creates enormous frictions that means that growth can't get going. And he provided this wonderful explanation of the East Asian miracle. He absolutely sums it up in this unconditional convergence of manufacturing that he's already provided us with evidence, and the observation that countries have nearly always used some kind of counterbalancing shortcut. Industrial policy, the super drug of the undervalued real exchange rate, which is one of my favourites and the most difficult to persuade African governments to contemplate. And as donors, I constantly am living with the sort of guilt that every time we shift $100 million of aid into a country, we are by necessity appreciating the exchange rate in some way and wanting to ensure that that cash is counterbalancing that by increasing supply-side productivity. Because if we don't, we're actually putting export sectors in a more difficult situation. And donors don't always manage to do that, but I'm acutely conscious of that. And then recently, what he's been talking about, this lovely idea that we can decompose growth into a fundamentals component, an unconditional convergence component, and a sectoral share component, which I think is a lovely way of seeing growth in aggregate. And then what we've just heard today, recently, this new work on this, there being a real genuine trade-off within services, and the great power of manufacturing was deep inelastic global markets, but we're having constrained domestic markets largely in services, which inevitably will turn productivity against price and mean that you cannot run into them as a growth driver. So, how can I criticise the great priest? I think Dani's history is excellent, but perhaps his futurology is not so good. I've observed in listening to his podcasts and lectures over the years that he always has an acutely perceptive understanding of the history, but ends every talk with reasons why it's not the same anymore, that the future will be worse. I wonder, Dani, if there's a slight tendency to view the technical door as half closed rather than half empty. Perhaps a little pessimism bias there. I remember him telling us that one of the reasons why the future is going to be more difficult than the past was that the WTO will be no longer tolerant of shortcuts, that it probably wouldn't tolerate the degree of real exchange undervaluation that China got away with. But I have noticed that you don't talk about that so much anymore. So perhaps that piece of pessimism proved not quite right. And I wonder if some of the other bits of pessimism will equally be discarded over the years of future Dani Rodrik presentations. And then I've got some reasons to question your tech pessimism, which is really the core argument of this. You make the point that technology or manufacturing technology is necessarily becoming less intensive in unskilled labour, and I think that's absolutely right. Absolutely, we can't disagree with that. And that you provide evidence of the deindustrialisation point processing earlier and earlier, potentially giving us with a sort of robotic future that every single automated process in the world will be done through electrical machines and there will be no room for unskilled labour at all. But I have some problems with bits of your data. So, for example, in your chart, you talk about a deindustrializing point of Nigeria in 1982, of Ghana in 1978. I don't think these are industrialization peaks. I think these are more like false starts, that these countries haven't yet really got on the train. So I think you need to discount these in looking at your true deindustrialization points. And then I also, just to build on Dirk's point, I think there's also a sort of classification problem in manufacturing industry at the moment, that with global value chains, what used to be manufacturing has now been componentized off into design services, actual assembly, marketing services, distribution services. So a lot of that whole lump would have been in one firm classified as manufacturing, but now is partly classified as services. So it could just be about the nature of the classification. And I think we really have to watch for that before we say, actually, manufacturing really is not becoming such a growth driver. And then the other point is I have to catch you out on your persistent use of logarithms in your charts, because hardly anybody knows the exponential table off the top of their head, and so they might not know that the exponent e to the power of 8.2 is still around $5,000. So even in your most pessimistic scenario of industrialization peaking at log $5,000, it's still a reasonable driver for development. We would be overjoyed to get some of the countries that DFID looks at to $5,000 per capita. And then lastly, in the tech point, yes, I completely accept your point that unskilled labour demand will be going, but it hasn't collapsed. It hasn't gone to zero. And still, relative to domestic markets, the international market is still a relatively deep, inelastic pool. That's the point about tech. And then a final point I'd like to make, which is really about political economy. I think that from where we sit in looking at the poorest countries in DFID, that you're probably underemphasizing the deadlock in political economies, which results in non-linear phenomena. It's almost as though your world is one in which there is linear progress in all these components of growth, and each one of them steadily grow. But I think we're increasingly we're living in a world that the countries that could have got these fundamentals right, they have already. The ones that could have done it easily, they have done so. And we're left with countries that are in various stages of fragility that, due to deadlocks in their political settlement, find it phenomenally difficult to attain fiscal macro stability, to attain institutions that can preside over long-term investments. And so the opportunities for these countries to create growth paths out of that now becomes highly sporadic. And I wonder if that isn't distorting your data picture, because what you have now is a non-linear, rather chaotic group of movers at the bottom of the pool. And then lastly, I think there may be an opportunity because of the tightening of the Chinese labour markets, as Dirk said. So there are some thoughts I had this morning, which I hope will provide some incentive for you to use economics in a slightly more optimistic way. Thank you.